units hold position. We have the perimeter secure. K-9 is sweeping the lower levels now.
The 14th of November, 1987. Chicago was still half asleep after a long, cold night of rain. 6:47 a.m. Security cameras in the lobby of the Marriott Hotel captured two men stepping outside. They wore dark coats, moving quickly but without panic. Neither of them looked back. No one knew that just minutes later, they would vanish from the world. They were Captain Michael Torres and First Officer David Chen, two veteran pilots, with more than 30 years of commercial flying experience between them. For them, that morning was supposed to be just another routine workday. A familiar flight, a route they had flown hundreds of times before. At 9:15 a.m., Flight 227 from Chicago to Denver was scheduled to depart. On board were 237 passengers, fathers hurrying home, mothers taking their children to visit grandparents, business travelers thinking only about the next meeting. None of them knew that the two men responsible for getting them there safely would never step into the cockpit. Shortly before 8 a.m., the pilot's rental car was discovered at O'Hare Airport. The engine was still running. The driver's door stood wide open. The key was still in the ignition, as if the driver had stepped away for just a moment. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no note, no ransom demand. Two men, two lives, simply gone. By noon, the airline was forced to assign a replacement flight crew. Flight 227 departed 2 hours late. It followed its planned route. It landed safely in Denver, as if nothing unusual had ever happened. But in Chicago, time had stopped. In another corner of the airport, a 7-year-old girl stood by the rain-streaked glass overlooking the runway. She clutched a stuffed rabbit in her arms, a prize her father had won for her at a summer fair. She asked her mother a simple question. "Mom, why hasn't Dad come out yet?" No one could answer her. That night, the FBI sealed off the parking lot. Red and blue lights reflected across the cold, wet concrete. Questions began to surface. Where did they go? Who saw them last? And why would two seasoned pilots leave everything behind? The investigation dragged on for more than a year. Then the file was closed. No bodies, no suspects, no explanation, only those left behind. Children who grew up with questions that never found answers. Families who learned how to live with absence. 36 years passed. The world changed. The airport expanded. Old hangars were abandoned, then slated for demolition. And then, on a gray, overcast morning, a concrete wall was torn down. What lay behind it was not just evidence. It was a warning. Because some secrets, no matter how deeply they are buried, will always find a way to return. That morning, rain poured relentlessly over O'Hare Airport. Water droplets clung to the terminal windows, blurring everything outside into a haze, like an unfinished painting. Sarah Vance stood pressed against the glass. She was only 7 years old. In her hands was a stuffed rabbit, its ears worn thin, clutched so tightly that her small fingers had turned white. The rabbit was a gift from her father, Michael Torres, brought home from the state fair the previous summer. He had spent nearly the entire evening trying to knock down enough targets, just to see his daughter's face light up with joy. To Sarah, it wasn't just a toy. It was the feeling of being loved. She rested her forehead against the cold glass, staring out at the runway where planes taxied one by one through the rain. Yellow lights reflected off the wet ground, stretching into trembling streaks of light. She turned to her mother. "Mom, is Dad's airplane big?" Catherine Vance knelt beside her daughter. She smiled, but her eyes betrayed the tension beneath. It was the smile of a woman trying to stay calm while worry had already begun knocking at the door. "Very big, sweetheart. Your dad flies the biggest planes there are." Catherine glanced at her watch. For the 12th time in less than an hour, Michael was always punctual. He had never made his family wait. Even on early flight days, he would still find time to call, just to say he had arrived safely. But this morning, the phone was silent. Sarah didn't know that. All she knew was that her father had promised to wave from the cockpit before takeoff. A small ritual, repeated year after year. She waited, for a very long time. Near noon, a security officer approached them. His voice was gentle, but firm. "Ma'am, please come with us." The small room behind the security area was cold and empty. Plastic chairs, harsh fluorescent lights, no windows. Sarah sat on one of the chairs, her feet dangling above the floor. The stuffed rabbit rested in her lap. She didn't understand why the adults were speaking in whispers. She didn't understand why her mother kept tightening her grip on her hand. By afternoon, Catherine began to tremble. She asked the same question again and again. "Where is my husband? Has anyone seen my husband?" No one could answer her. When night fell, the airport was still brightly lit. But inside Catherine, something had collapsed. By midnight, Sarah had fallen asleep on the chair. The stuffed rabbit slipped from her hands and lay quietly on the plastic seat. Its button eyes reflected the overhead lights, empty and lifeless. A few steps away, Catherine stood with a phone pressed to her ear, her voice breaking as she tried to explain to her in-laws, "Michael hasn't come home. We don't know where he is." That night, a family began learning how to live with emptiness. A child began growing up with an absence that had no name, and a question, no matter how simple, that would never be answered. Why hasn't Dad come out yet? That question followed Sarah for the rest of her life. Within 24 hours of the disappearance of Michael Torres and David Chen, O'Hare Airport turned into a federal maze. The FBI was everywhere, from the rental car lot to the pilot's lounge, from maintenance corridors hidden behind the terminal walls to offices few passengers ever knew existed. They reviewed security footage frame by frame. They interviewed hotel staff. They tore through months of flight schedules, duty logs, and personnel records. But the deeper they searched, the emptier everything became. No one had seen the men after they left the hotel. No suspicious phone calls. No unusual bank transactions. No signs of planning an escape. Michael Torres was a devoted husband and a loving father. A stable savings account. No debt. No affairs. No reason to disappear. David Chen was the same. A disciplined, serious pilot, trusted completely by his colleagues. And yet, when answers refused to surface, suspicion began to seep in. The FBI drafted colder theories. Maybe they vanished voluntarily. Maybe they were tied to financial misconduct. Maybe they had seen something they weren't supposed to and chose to run. These theories didn't stay confined to paper. They quietly pressed down on the people left behind. Catherine Vance was asked the same questions again and again. "Are you sure you really knew your husband? Could he have been hiding something from you?" Each time, Catherine felt less like someone being protected, and more like someone under interrogation. The man she had loved for years was slowly reduced to a question mark. Sarah was too young to understand the words, but she felt the change. Conversations that stopped when she entered the room, eyes that avoided hers, heavy sighs in the dark, long after bedtime. Time passed. Weeks turned into months, months into more months. Every lead ended in a dead end. Every press conference concluded with the same sentence: "We are still investigating." After 14 months, the FBI issued its final determination: insufficient evidence to identify a crime, insufficient grounds to continue the investigation. The file was closed. 2 men officially became names on a missing persons list. Not victims, not homicide cases, just individuals of unknown whereabouts. For the system, it was the end. For their families, it was the beginning of a different kind of pain. Because without a body, there is no funeral, no grave to place flowers on, no moment to say goodbye. Only waiting stretched endlessly forward. Catherine learned how to live alone. Sarah grew up surrounded by absences she couldn't name. Every time an airplane crossed the Chicago sky, she would look up, wondering if somewhere, her father might be looking down. The case was sent to archives. Dust settled over the pages, but the questions never disappeared. And sometimes, the cases that are most thoroughly forgotten are the ones hiding the most terrifying truths. 36 years had passed since that cold, rainy morning. The world had changed. O'Hare Airport expanded with new terminals. Old runways were repaired. Aging hangars were gradually forgotten, then placed on demolition lists. But for Sarah Vance, time had never really moved. She grew up, went to school, graduated, became an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune. It wasn't a coincidence. Every missing persons case, every file left to gather dust, every story without an ending, pulled Sarah back to that morning when she was 7 years old, standing by the airport window, waiting for a father who never came. That day, Sarah was sitting at her desk, papers scattered across the surface, the steady rhythm of a keyboard. An ordinary day, like any other. Her phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. Sarah answered. Hello? On the other end, there was no greeting, only very soft breathing, as if the caller was hesitating, or afraid. Then a man's voice dropped low, almost a whisper. They're still here. 3 words. Short, chilling. Before Sarah could ask anything, the call cut off. The screen went dark. No way to call back. She sat frozen for a few seconds. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Over the past 36 years, she had received many calls. Curious strangers, people claiming to have leads, false hopes. But this one was different. No promises, no explanations, no request for money. Just a statement. They're still here. At the same time, at O'Hare Airport, a demolition crew was dispatched to Hangar 7B. An aging structure, abandoned since the late 1980s, sitting quietly on the edge of the airport, like a forgotten piece of memory. The demolition had been delayed again and again for vague reasons. Paperwork, budgets, procedures. Until that morning, when the first sledgehammer was raised, no one knew that what was about to be broken was more than just a concrete wall. Elsewhere in the city, Sarah pushed back from her desk. She looked out the window. The Chicago sky was gray familiar. She didn't know why, but something in her gut told her something had been awakened. After 36 years of silence, a case long believed to be dead was preparing to return. And this time, it wasn't coming back to whisper. Hangar 7B sat on the far edge of O'Hare Airport, an aging structure of gray concrete, abandoned for more than 3 decades. No aircraft, no engineers, only thick walls, broken light fixtures hanging loose, and the cold feeling of a place time had forgotten. That morning, the demolition crew began work like any other day. No one thought this site was special, just another old structure that needed to disappear to make room for the future. The first sledgehammer struck the wall. The sound echoed through the empty space, dry, heavy, final. A worker named Tommy Garrett sensed something was wrong by the second blow. The wall was thicker than it should have been, unlike any wall they had demolished before. He paused, wiped the sweat from his face, then swung again. This time, the concrete broke. But behind it wasn't a utility cavity. Not wiring, not pipes. It was darkness. A small room, completely absent from the blueprints. Tommy shined his flashlight inside. The beam swept over something metallic, then leather, and then a shoe. A men's leather shoe. A pilot's shoe. The flashlight slipped from his hand and hit the concrete with a sharp crack. His voice shook as he called to his co-workers. Call the police. Less than an hour later, Hangar 7B was sealed off. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance. Flashing lights reflected against the old walls. When officers stepped into the sealed room, the air was so cold their breath was visible. The room measured less than 10 square meters. No windows. No ventilation. No exit from the inside. 2 bodies were seated against the wall. They were still wearing pilot uniforms. Collars neat. Ties frayed by time. Time inside that room seemed frozen. The bodies weren't lying down. They hadn't collapsed. They were sitting, as if they had been waiting for something that never came. Beside them were details that forced even seasoned investigators to look away. Deep scratch marks gouged into the walls. Long, chaotic lines desperate. Fingernails dragged across concrete, searching for a way out. Between the 2 men lay a folded jacket, placed carefully on the floor, like a pillow, or a final act of care in hours where hope no longer existed. They didn't die quickly. Experts concluded they had survived in that room for several days, without air, without water, without light, and with too much time to understand that no one was coming. Near the corner of the room, under the harsh scene lights, words came into view. 3 words carved deeply into the concrete with a sharp object. Flight 227 knows. Not a plea. Not a cry for help. A message, as if, before the last breath left his lungs, one of them still wanted the world to know they had seen something. Identification was confirmed only hours later. Captain Michael Torres. First Officer David Chen. Missing since 1987. Found after 36 years. Inside a room that was never supposed to exist. The news spread rapidly. Families who had lived in silence were dragged back into the most painful moment of their lives. And elsewhere in the city, Sarah Vance received a call. This time, there was no whisper. Her father had been found, but the truth he left behind was far more terrifying than his disappearance ever was. Sarah Vance's office was wrapped in silence. Only the soft rustle of paper and the uneven sound of her own breathing remained. 36 years after her father vanished, Sarah finally opened the old cardboard boxes the FBI had returned in 1989. They had sat untouched in storage for decades, as if she herself had been afraid of what might be waiting inside. In one unremarkable box, Sarah found her father's flight log. The leather cover was worn, the corners frayed, the scent of old paper mixed with the smell of time. Michael Torres was a careful man. His logbooks were meticulously kept, down to the smallest detail. Dates, weather, aircraft condition. There was no room for emotion. Until the final pages, Sarah noticed the change immediately. The handwriting was no longer steady. The pen strokes were hurried, as if the writer no longer had much time. The 23rd of October 1987. Flight 227. Chicago to Denver. In the margin, a small note appeared, nearly pressed into the edge of the page. Seat 14C occupied. Not on the passenger manifest. Sarah read the line again. Once, twice, 3 times. She wasn't a pilot, but she knew exactly what that meant. On a commercial flight, every passenger must be accounted for. No exceptions. The next page. Another Flight 227, just a week later. The same marginal note. Seat 14C. The person was still there. This time, her father added more. He spoke with Chen. He noticed too. David Chen, the colleague who had died alongside her father in the sealed room. The entries grew longer, heavier. November 3. Cargo weight discrepancy. Nearly 100 kilograms over the declared load. Passenger in seat 14C carried a large suitcase. Bypassed inspection. Sarah had to stop. She set the logbook down on the desk. Her hands trembled slightly. Her father had seen something. Not once, but many times, and he wasn't the only one. In another box, Sarah found a smaller notebook. Thin cover. Different handwriting. It belonged to David Chen. The writing was neat, careful, like someone trying to preserve the truth before it could be erased. David documented each flight, each date, each appearance of the man in seat 14C. The man never changed seats. Always 14C. Always carrying a metal suitcase. Always escorted through a private exit by airport staff after landing. No fingerprints. No ticket. No name. Just a seat. And a void in the system. The final page was written in compressed, urgent strokes. If anything happens to us, remember seat 14C. Remember that we tried. Sarah sat motionless for a long time. Suddenly, everything became terrifyingly clear. Her father hadn't disappeared because of a mistake. Not an accident. Not an escape. He had seen something no one was ever meant to see. A secret moving freely among innocent crowds. Hidden in a perfectly ordinary seat. On an ordinary flight. And in that moment, Sarah understood something else. Her father had a choice. Silence. A normal life. But he didn't take it. He chose the truth. And the price of that choice was his own life. Seat 14C was no longer just a number. It became a warning that sometimes the most dangerous thing is not hiding in the dark, but sitting right beside us, 10,000 meters in the air, on a flight that feels completely safe. Gate 17 at O'Hare Airport no longer exists, at least, not on the surface. After countless renovations and expansions, the area that once served as an old boarding gate was erased from the map. New walls were built. Modern glass sealed everything over. But beneath the polished floors, the past was still there. Just before dawn the next morning, airport engineers opened an access point to the old infrastructure beneath the international terminal. The space was narrow, the ceiling low. The smell of dampness and aging metal rushed out as soon as the steel door swung open. Sarah descended last. Each step felt like moving backward through time, closer to the morning when she was 7, closer to the father she had waited for over 36 years. According to archived blueprints, the old Gate 17 sat directly above this area, a technical compartment once used as a service closet for airport staff. Flashlights swept across raw concrete walls. The silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. One technician stopped. He crouched and pointed at an old panel, buried under layers of paint and dust. It's been opened before. When the crowbar was wedged into the seam, the panel popped loose with a dry crack. Behind it was a small, empty cavity. And there, deep in the shadows, sat a metal box. Not large, not locked. Its surface thick with dust, but it was far heavier than it looked. When the box was set down on the floor, Sarah saw two faintly engraved words on the lid. Michael Torres. Her hands began to shake, not from cold, but from the realization that her father had prepared for this moment a long time ago. The lid came off. Inside was an old camera, a film camera, carefully wrapped in layers of yellowed plastic. 3 rolls of film lay beside it, unexposed, untouched. Beneath them was a thin notebook, the familiar handwriting of David Chen. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes burning. Her father hadn't just discovered something. He had tried to preserve proof, tried to leave the truth behind for the world. David Chen's notebook was opened right there. The words were clear, careful, almost desperate. He documented every appearance of the man in seat 14C, every flight, every date. Always a metal suitcase, always escorted through a private route, always kept away from main security cameras. And most important, there were photographs. David wrote that they had secretly photographed the passenger, captured him walking through the gate without a ticket, captured the moment the suitcase was transferred into the cargo hold. The first roll of film was rushed to the police photo lab. The darkroom glowed under dim red light. The air was thick with chemical fumes. Sarah stood behind the glass, her heart pounding as images slowly emerged on the photographic paper. The first photo, Gate 17, 1987. Passengers lined up to board, and in the corner of the frame, a man in a suit, holding a metal suitcase. No badge, no ticket. The second photo, the man stepping through the gate, an airport employee waving him forward. Other passengers were stopped, their faces confused. The third image silenced the room completely. The aircraft cargo hold. The suitcase opened. Inside were tightly wrapped rectangular blocks. Not money. Too large. Too heavy. No one needed to say it out loud. Drugs. Sarah covered her mouth. Her legs felt unsteady. Her father and David Chen had seen everything. They knew their flight had been turned into a tool. Knew that above hundreds of innocent passengers, a criminal operation was moving quietly through the sky. And they hadn't looked away. In the final notebook of David Chen, one line was underlined again and again. If anything happens, the evidence is at Gate 17. Sarah slowly closed her eyes. Her father had known he might not survive. And yet, he still chose to leave the truth behind. That small metal box, hidden beneath the airport for 36 years, held more than film. It held courage. It held a choice. And it held the answer to the question that had haunted a child for an entire lifetime. Where did Dad go? Now Sarah knew. And that truth was beginning to shake the people who had buried it. Raymond Holloway was not a criminal in the way people usually imagine. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't threaten anyone. He never killed with his own hands. He was just an airport employee. In 1987, Raymond worked at a boarding gate at O'Hare. A steady job, a livable wage, a wife, a young son waiting for him to come home every night. He was the kind of man no one ever suspected. Always on time, always by the book, always greeting passengers with a polite smile. And because of that, he was chosen. When police finally came to Raymond, 36 years had passed. He was no longer the middle-aged man from back then. His hair had turned white, his back was bent, his memory fractured by illness and time. The nursing home was eerily quiet. Raymond sat by the window, staring out at the parking lot. His eyes were empty, as if focused on somewhere else entirely. They showed him an old photograph. The image captured the moment he waved the man in seat 14C through the gate. Raymond stared at it for a long time. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. Not quite recognition, but fear. Then it faded. "I don't remember," he said softly. "Is it lunchtime yet?" But the truth wasn't in Raymond's words. It was in the drawer beside his bed. Beneath an old shirt lay a small metal box. Inside were $50,000 in cash. The bills neatly bundled, as if never spent. A passport, Raymond's photograph, but under a different name, and a piece of paper. The letter was written in short, cold lines. No greeting, no signature. "Your debt has been paid. The 2 pilots have been dealt with. You stay silent. You retire. You live out the rest of your life. If you speak, your son will die." Below it, written in trembling handwriting, Raymond had added, "I'm sorry. I didn't know they would kill them." May God forgive me. It wasn't a defense. It was a belated confession. From a man who had lived his entire life in fear, Raymond didn't kill Michael Torres and David Chen, but he opened the door. And once that door was opened, none of them could ever go back. For 36 years, Raymond lived in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the silence of someone always waiting to be exposed. Every time he heard about a plane crash, every time the news mentioned an airport, every time he saw his son in a police uniform, the fear returned. He had protected his own child, but the price was the lives of 2 other fathers. When Raymond died not long afterward, there was no public confession, no trial. Only a bitter truth remained, that in the greatest crimes, sometimes you don't need monsters. You only need an ordinary person, a moment of weakness, and a letter terrifying enough. Raymond Holloway never killed anyone with his hands, but his guilt outlived the truth itself. Gerald Summers was the kind of man you would never suspect. He dressed neatly, spoke calmly, always appeared at the right moment with the right answer. For more than 40 years at O'Hare Airport, Gerald Summers built the image of a man who protected order, the one who ensured every flight was safe, every passenger accounted for. Very few people knew that before he ever wore the airport security suit, Gerald had been special forces, trained to observe, to control, and to eliminate threats without leaving traces. When he was younger, he understood one thing very clearly. Every system has blind spots, and the person who controls the system decides who gets seen and who is allowed to disappear. In 1987, Gerald Summers was not yet head of airport security, but he was there. He knew where every camera was placed. He knew which hours no one paid attention. He knew which employees needed money, and which ones had families that could be threatened. Michael Torres and David Chen didn't know who Gerald Summers was. They only knew that someone inside the system was helping a passenger who officially didn't exist. And they made a fatal mistake when they tried to name that person. The photographs from the final roll of film revealed the truth clearly. Gerald Summers standing in a small office behind the terminal, beside the man from seat 14C, beside Raymond Holloway. No smile, no concern, only the eyes of someone accustomed to making decisions for others. To Gerald, the 2 pilots were just variables, ordinary people who had wandered into a network that was too large, too old, too rich. And in that world, kindness is a liability. Gerald Summers didn't kill anyone with his own hands. He didn't need to. He knew whom to call, which door to open, and most importantly, how to make death look like disappearance. The room inside Hangar 7B was no random choice. It had no cameras, no traffic, no reason for anyone to ever return. The 2 men were locked inside not to be killed quickly, but to let time do the work. Because to Gerald, prolonged fear was more effective than a bullet. 36 years later, Gerald Summers continued to rise. He became the airport's head of security, the man who stood before the press whenever something went wrong, the one who reassured the public that everything was under control. And in a twisted sense, he was telling the truth. Everything was under his control. Until the wall was broken, until the bodies were found, until the photographs from 1987 surfaced. For the first time in decades, Gerald Summers lost control. He began to monitor, to threaten, to warn those digging into the past, because Gerald understood perfectly well, if the truth came out, the entire system he had built would collapse. Not just an airport, not just a city, but a network hidden beneath the disguise of security and order. Gerald Summers did not see himself as a villain. In his mind, he was simply the man keeping the machine running. But there was one thing Gerald never understood. That people like Michael Torres and David Chen, even when buried beneath concrete for 36 years, can still return, not through life, but through truth. And once the truth has spoken, even the most powerful gatekeeper can never lock it away again. From the moment the film was developed, everything changed. This was no longer an old case being reopened, no longer historical questions. The truth now had a shape, and it frightened someone. Sarah Vance realized it on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, as she left the newsroom, crossed the street, and instinctively turned around. A black car was parked not far away, engine running, windows tinted. She told herself it was just a coincidence, but the next day, and the day after that, the car was still there, never approaching, never leaving, just watching. At the same time, Detective James Holloway began noticing strange signs. files disappearing from the airport's internal system, security cameras suddenly going offline, phone calls that disconnected the moment he answered. "They're watching us," James said quietly, not to threaten, but to wait. The strike came faster than they expected. One evening, James returned to the airport to review old security records. The office was empty, fluorescent lights humming. Everything seemed normal, until he heard the door close behind him. The blow came from the back of his head. Hard, precise. James collapsed onto the floor. Blood spread across the cold tiles. As his vision faded, he heard a calm voice. "Stop. Some things shouldn't be dug up." When police arrived, James was still alive. But the computer had been wiped clean. All that remained were a few photographs he had managed to upload to the cloud. Enough to understand one thing. They had touched the core of something far bigger. That same night, Sarah returned to her apartment. The door hadn't been forced. Nothing was stolen. But the boxes containing her father's documents had been torn apart. Papers scattered across the floor. On the table lay a photograph. A photo of Sarah herself, taken from a distance. Sharp, deliberate. On the back, a simple printed message. "Stop. Some secrets should stay buried." Sarah sank into a chair. Her hands shook uncontrollably. For the first time in 36 years, she understood what her father had felt. The feeling of being watched, measured, placed on a scale between truth and survival. But instead of fear, something else surfaced. Anger. If they were scared enough to act, it meant the truth was very close. Rachel Kim, leading the investigation, made a decision that night. Witness protection, increased surveillance, fast-tracked procedures. No more moving slowly. No more caution. From that moment on, the roles reversed. Those who had hidden in the shadows began to emerge. Panicked phone calls, unusual trips, careless traces left behind in their haste. The hunt had changed direction. Michael Torres and David Chen had once been hunted for telling the truth. Now that same truth was hunting the people who killed them. And somewhere in the city, Gerald Summers understood. What he had buried for 36 years was pushing its way back to the surface. It could not be locked away. It could not be silenced. The game was over. And this time, there was nowhere left to hide. When the files James Holloway had managed to upload were finally recovered, the last pieces of the picture fell into place. It wasn't about a single flight. Not a single year. It was 40 years. 40 years of passengers who didn't officially exist. 40 years of suitcases that were never inspected. 40 years of people erased from the system as if they had never passed through. The records revealed more than 300 illegal transports, drugs, cash, and people, fugitives, witnesses who needed to disappear, individuals flown under names that were not their own. All of them passed through the same place, O'Hare Airport, under the protection of one man, Gerald Summers. By the time the arrest warrant was issued, Gerald Summers was no longer in Chicago. He left quietly. No resignation, no announcement, a flight to Mexico, a passport under a different name, an escape plan prepared long in advance. But this time, he wasn't fast enough. Gerald Summers was arrested at a small airport in southern Mexico, just as he was preparing to board yet another flight. He didn't resist. He didn't panic. He simply stood still, like someone who had always known this moment would come. When the news broke, public outrage exploded. Not because of the scale of the crimes, but because of the time. 40 years. 40 years of a criminal network operating inside one of America's largest airports. 40 years under the banner of security. 40 years without anyone asking questions big enough. Hearings were convened. Names began to surface. People who had stayed silent started to speak. Some out of fear. Some out of remorse. Some simply because they understood that this time, there was no way back. The case of Michael Torres and David Chen was officially closed. Not in silence, but in the light. The two pilots had not fled. They had not betrayed anyone. They had not vanished. They were killed for doing the right thing. Sarah Vance stood before the press at the final briefing. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. My father could have stayed silent. He could have looked away, but he didn't. And because of that, we now know the truth. James Holloway was discharged from the hospital a few weeks later. He never returned to work at the airport. He said there were too many ghosts there. Raymond Holloway, his father, died not long after. No trial, no public confession, just a man who carried his guilt to the end of his life. And Gerald Summers, The man who once controlled every door now sits behind bars, crushed by the very system he had manipulated for decades. Justice came late, but it came, and for the families who had waited 36 years, this was not an ending. It was the first time they were finally able to breathe. Because at last, the truth was no longer buried, not even for one more day. 6 months after the case was brought into the open, O'Hare Airport was still as crowded as ever. Flights continued to depart. Passengers kept rushing past one another. Electronic boards blinked with arrivals and departures. None of them knew that, beneath the polished floors, 2 men had once died in the dark, simply because they refused to look away. Sarah Vance stood in front of Gate 17 inches, the international terminal. The gate no longer resembled what it once was. Everything had been replaced with modern glass and steel, but Sarah knew. She was standing exactly where her father had stood on his final morning. 36 years ago, Michael Torres had stood here, carrying a truth too heavy to ignore, and a choice that was never easy. He could have stayed silent, kept flying, kept being a father, kept living, but he didn't. From the small bag she carried, Sarah took out a box. Inside was her father's pilot badge, the one he always pinned to his chest before every flight. She had kept it for 36 years, as if holding on to a part of who he was. Sarah opened the box. Her fingers brushed the metal, worn smooth by time. Then she placed the badge on the glass ledge by the window, where the morning light fell. "For you, Dad," she whispered. "Your flight is complete now." There was no answer. Only the distant sound of flight announcements over the loudspeakers. Only the rolling of suitcase wheels across the floor. But in that moment, Sarah felt lighter than she ever had before. Not because the pain was gone, but because it finally had a name. It had truth. It had an ending. Gate 17 bears no grand memorial, no wreaths, no crowd stopping to look. Only a small badge, lying quietly amid the flow of passing travelers. 3 days later, a security officer found the badge and took it to Lost and Found. No one knew who it belonged to. No one knew the story behind it. And perhaps that was enough, because some stories do not need to be seen to carry their weight. From that point on, Flight 227 was quietly retired. No announcement, no explanation. A new pilot training center was named, the Torres Chen Memorial Center. Not to commemorate death, but to remember a choice. That in a world where silence is easy, there are still people who choose to speak, even when the price is everything. And sometimes, when the airport sleeps in the deep of night, late shift workers say they see 2 men in pilot uniforms, standing near Gate 17. They don't speak. They only check their watches, as if waiting for a flight that will never take off. Not to leave, but to stand guard. To guard the truth. To guard the countless unnamed people who place their trust in a safe flight. Because there are people who, even after they have left this world, continue to do their duty. And their final flight is not in the sky, but in the memory of those who remain.